was at the voice gathering.
All right, why don't we get started here? At 3:30, a little after. So I feel like I need to congratulate you all because I am congratulating myself, getting to the last session here, and I feel full. I feel stuffed. I feel fed. I feel empowered. I feel challenged. But there's still room for dessert, which is what we're going to be getting here with the fireside chat with the imaginary fire. I apologize to the panelists that we actually couldn't violate the fire code. That's a problem. So this last session that we're going to be having, the closing plenary, the topic is future of demand flexibility. And the question that we'll be asking, really the two questions that we'll be asking and answering is, should demand flexibility be treated as supply or demand? Right? Big pause, big question mark there. And then what mechanisms are needed to scale it responsibly? And we're honored to have a great panel here. Our chair is Pearl Donohoo-Vallett, who's a technical advisor at FERC. And I'll turn it over to her to moderate and chair this last session. Thank you, Pearl.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for sticking around for what is actually going to be the best session of the entire conference. So tell your friends if they're out in the hallway that they're missing out. As James said, my name is Pearl Donohoo-Vallett. I'm a technical advisor for Commissioner Chang at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Before we get going, like all FERC employees, I come with a disclaimer and it's a little bit long, so bear with me. I do not speak on behalf of Commissioner Chang. I do not speak on behalf of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I speak on behalf only of myself. I also cannot be part of any conversation that regards a case currently before the commission. I will try to flag if that comes up, but otherwise I have to leave the room, and I don't know what would happen to our poor panelists if I have to exit the room during the middle of a question. I will also quickly preempt, I think, Mark's question potentially, which is that I would say we are very welcoming of comments on the DOE proposal. They have been noticed and comments are due on November 14th. So we look forward to reading all of your opinions on that matter. So when we got this topic from ESIG, I sort of looked at it and I said, wow, that's a massive question. There's no way that even this panel, which has an incredible amount of expertise across the entire value chain of load side resources, is going to be able to answer it. And we're not, frankly, going to try to. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 3 areas and we're going to start the conversation, but recognizing that this is the start of a conversation and there's a lot of work to do. So we're going to talk today about where demand flexibility, load side resources, what kind of services they can reliably provide. And we'll talk a lot about what reliably provide means. We're going to talk about oversight, noticing that we've had some challenges, I think Mike would agree, with non-performance from demand response in some of the markets. And then we're also going to talk about, regardless if it's demand side or if it's supply side, I think we all agree that there's a lot of untapped potential. So how do we bring that untapped potential to bear on the problems? When we set this panel up, we were very clear with panelists that we encouraged respectful disagreement and pointing out of where friction is as we start to talk about where load side resources fit. It's not easy. It's messy. These are communities that don't practice, that don't always talk to one another. And I would encourage the audience, as you ask questions, don't be afraid to ask a question that feels awkward or that is going to say, hey, I don't think this is going to work for this reason. We need to have those clear discussions about what are the challenges. So please don't shy away. We're also going to keep it pretty conversational. There is no PowerPoint. So don't open up your computer and think that you're going to be able to zone out and like miss the first 3 minutes of presentation. We're going to keep it really conversational. We're going to do 5 minutes with some quick opening statements. Then we're going to go do some preset Q&A to make sure that we get some key perspectives. And then we're going to open it up for questions, which I hope is pretty robust. So before I hand it over to Travis to kick us off, can I just ask who in the room participates in any kind of demand response managed EV charging program? Does anyone in the room participate in one? Wow. Yeah, I think this speaks to the challenge. That's not much. So we have a challenge set before us, and we're going to let Travis lead us off to help set the stage and get us underway.
Thank you very much, Pearl and ESIG, for having me and my fellow panelists. I'm Travis Kavulla. I head up regulatory affairs for NRG. NRG is a power generating company and a retail provider of power and gas services. We've got about 8 million customers. We serve about a quarter of the load in ERCOT as a retailer, and about 10% of the load of the Eastern restructured markets, with other businesses in California and Alberta. And everywhere we operate, we are short generation. So we're very interested as a net buyer of energy in managing our contractual obligations to serve load through demand side solutions to minimize the cost of doing so where possible. And in thinking about demand flexibility generally, I tend to conceptualize it as policy people will do through the lens of public policy into about 3 business models. And the first, like is proffered by the panel description, is when demand acts as demand in response organically to emergent price signals for the price of electricity or the component goods, energy, capacity, transmission, distribution. This can be consumers acting by themselves in relation to those prices, or properly incentivized agents, their retailers, acting in response to the upstream cost of goods sold that inform those retail customers, to the degree that those retailers in their agency of the customer can actually somehow reach into the customer's premise and manage load in some active way, either by their own supervisory control of those loads or by inducing customer behavioral response through price signals. So that's one way of doing this. I think the second way business model is sort of what's come to be known as capital D, capital R, demand response, the dispatchable attributes of a flexible load that's sort of jerry-rigged as a supply resource into the wholesale markets. This is a market invented out of whole cloth by our friends at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it's summoned into being firms responsible for what are still today the largest volumes of demand flexibility that exist organically or in this configuration in the United States. It exists exclusively in the FERC-regulated RTOs, so it does not exist outside of the RTOs, except for a limited small market for certain ancillary services in ERCOT, the Texas market. And third and finally, you have regulated utility programs that are regulated by states that procure demand flexibility in the same way that these monopolies procure everything else, sometimes through an RFP or competitive solicitation, sometimes through an avoided cost-based tariff, sometimes because you know Bob, and Bob's a pretty good guy to provide you some services. This is also an active jerry-rigging demand response into less of an organic, active consumer-side behavior. But unlike DR, the marketplace here is monopsonized with the utility as a sole buyer, and here I'm forced to say a nice thing about utilities. It can also be created around certain elements of utility service, like the deferral of upgrades to distribution circuits that are very difficult to price in more liberalized approaches of the first two. You can probably tell roughly where my sympathies lie in this debate, but the conditions necessary to obtain the platonic ideal of option number 1, demand acting as demand, often do not, perhaps never obtain. And even in Texas, residential retail electric providers don't face price exposure to the time-varying characteristics of all the constituent elements of electricity service. So for residential customers there, for example, transmission is priced through regulation on a flat basis, and there's no value stack for organic residential demand response in relation to anything other than energy or ancillary services. In the Eastern restructured markets, even though the regulatory model of retail competition is more imperfect, retailers do actually face more of the value stack. So, for example, in our New Jersey operations in the PSEG service territory, nearly half of our goods sold were demand-related transmission charges. However, the balkanization of utility service territories and the lack of standardization in utility practice imposes a significant transaction costs that can prevent scaling up flexible demand-oriented retailers to engage organically. I mean, to give you a very relevant example from the Commonwealth here, if you're a customer right here in Philadelphia, you have a smart meter on your house, but the local utility isn't actually using that smart meter to measure your peak demand for the purpose of establishing your capacity and transmission obligations. Instead, your obligation to purchase transmission and capacity is based on a hypothetical load profile applicable to residential customers. But if you live an hour's drive up the 475 in Allentown, the utility does use its smart meters to meter the peak load contribution requirements for capacity and transmission, allowing a plausible theoretical model for a retailer to exist if anyone wanted to spend their money trying to scale up a retail business model that is different across dozens and dozens of different utility service territories that do these things differently. So let me end by observing that given the fact that we do have these hundreds of different models, not just 50, but hundreds, some combination of those three options is inevitably going to be the future of demand flexibility. And though I'd love to be a purist, the more offensive thing than poorly designed avenues to incorporating demand response into the power sector is probably not doing so at all. Thank you. Look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Travis. And that was an excellent rundown to level set us where we are. I'm Karen Onaran. I'm the president and CEO of ELCON. We are the trade association for large industrial consumers of energy. So we represent manufacturers across the country. We do not represent any data centers, so we are not part of that problem, but we are part of the large load equation. And we have been demand response participants. Traditionally, industrials have been participating in these demand response programs. We're not typically these price chasers as some other loads are, where they're constantly monitoring demand and ramping up or ramping down according to prices, but we are responsive to calls if there is a desire to back down some of our demand to meet, to shave off some of that peak, or if there are system emergencies. I will say that we've been doing the demand response. It's, something that we value, but I think that there's just been a lot of lost opportunities. And I think that there could be more participation from industrial customers, especially, and Pearl, you can tell me if I can't say the co-location word, but no co-location word. All right. We could be a supplier in situations where if we do have backup generation and we are allowed to site generation on site, we would be not only those just backing down some of our demand, but could actually contribute supply in emergency situations or in situations where there is really high demand. So really interested in hearing some of the perspectives from the others to see what kind of programs, what kind of things can we do? The key to this is incentives, unfortunately. You really need to incent people to participate in these demand response programs. And I can't speak on behalf of retail customers, even though I am a retail customer. But for the industrials, I plan to provide that little bit of that aspect, and really try to tease out some opportunities that we are missing in demand response to help meet this, I don't want to say crisis, but we are seeing just a tremendous amount of large load come on, and we're seeing timelines for building generation and building that transmission being long. And so part of helping meet and bridge that gap is going to be demand response. So I think that this is a very timely topic and extremely important. So let's figure out where our opportunities are. What kind of incentives do we need? How do we make this something that is attractive to customers, whether they be retail, CNI, or other? What we really need to start thinking about this. We've been dabbling in it for, a decade plus. But now's the time to really put pen to paper and figure out how much can we get from demand response as we navigate these huge challenges that we have before us. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hello, everyone. My name is Sanem Sergici. I'm a principal with the Brattle Group. Brattle Group is a global economics and consulting company, and we've been pretty active in load flexibility matters and working with regulators and utilities around the globe on this issue. So thank you to ESIG for having me on this panel today. And I'm going to pick it up where Karen left it off and highlight why this is really an opportune time for us to really get super serious about load flexibility. Demand is becoming just as strategic as supply as we continue to decarbonize. And that's because load flexibility allows us to move consumption to the right hours and not just add more generation to the system. And by shifting the consumption from those, high price, high demand hours, we are able to shave peaks. We are able to use existing assets more efficiently instead of trying to rush and build more transmission, more generation, more distribution. We need to do those things, but we are obviously running into some constraints in terms of how fast, how much of those things that we can build. And load flexibility also improves reliability by turning millions of devices into fast dispatchable virtual power plants. And we have most of the necessary ingredients right now. We have the smart rates. We could have more of them, but we at least have some of the implementations across the country today. We have automation. We have aggregators, we have some protocols, we have market rules. So the task at hand is to scale what works today and paying for flexibility as a first-class resource. And again, this matters particularly now because three waves are colliding. Rapid electrification. We see electrification of buildings and transportation, large loads, data centers. We see more of the highly variable renewable resources, and we have been running into more extreme weather. So we can't really build our way out with supply alone, neither should we, even if we can, because studies after studies, we see that load flexibility could be the least cost solution. And there are a lot of research organizations, including ours, quantifying the potential associated with building these virtual power plants. And a recent study we published showed that meeting the resource adequacy needs in 2030, we could use virtual power plants and achieve 15 to 35 billion savings with respect to or compared to conventional resources. And this is not even including all the societal benefits associated with reduced emissions, improved reliability, and things of that nature. Another important point to emphasize is that we are experiencing unprecedented rate increases. Between 24 and 25, residential class has seen 5% rate increase over that 1 year period. And there's a recent LBNL Brattle study that looked into the reasons for that rate increases. But we all know that load flexibility can really go a long way in terms of mitigating the pace of those rate increases going forward. And targeted load flexibility is another area I want to highlight because targeted DR load flexibility can allow utilities to avoid or defer T&D upgrades by relieving these local constraints. And the cheapest megawatts is the megawatt that we don't have to build or we build later. Again, helping to pace those required rate increases. There are also important reliability implications. Automated DR provides operating reserves and contingency support in minutes, extremely important during key, weather events. Load flexibility also improves diversity of the resource mix. Instead of relying on single assets centrally, we are relying on thousands of flexible loads orchestrated through DERMS and other operating systems. And aggregated into reliable resources for the system. So the bottom line is load flexibility is how we keep prices low, reliability high, and decarbonization on schedule using the assets that we already have. And it's about time we really figure out how to do it right and how to do it fast. Let me pause here and turn it over to Michael.
Great, thank you. First, I want to do a level set. So we're talking about demand flexibility, load reduction, peak shaving, peak shifting, if you will, load management. It should have been clear from all these speakers before me that we're talking about all this in respect to electricity demand, trying to meet the power balance through a reduction in demand. But I did want to do a level set here. So when we talk about LeBron James doing load management, that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, so just be clear of that. So at MISO, I'm an economist at MISO. Again, let me be clear. We have no demand programs in MISO. None. We conduct markets, lots of different markets to support a reliable grid. We have day-ahead market, energy markets, real-time energy markets. We have ancillary service markets for regulation, spin, non-spin, ramp, short-term reserve. We have capacity construct. We conduct incremental auction for that, prompt auction every year. All of those markets, we allow demand to participate. We don't have any programs, but if the market participant that has a demand resource is willing and able to provide the service in question, they can come in and perform. And in every instance, for every one of those markets, we have able market participants. We've had a market participant for a long, long time providing regulation under AGC. I'm not talking about behind the meter generation. I'm talking about moving demand, moving load up and down every 4 seconds based on control from MISO. And they perform better than the generators. We did the analysis, absolutely. During the polar vortex 11 years ago, when we called on a lot of contingency reserves, as the Eastern RTOs did as well, we did the analysis. In terms of generation, a lot of the gas lines were frozen, the pumps were frozen, a lot of the gas turbines didn't show up when called on. We had some demand resources, they performed tremendously. Now, limited sample, okay, maybe there's a little self-selection that came in, absolutely, but we had a couple of demand resources who performed admirably. So no demand programs, but if you're a market participant with demand response and you're willing and able to participate, you're welcome to register and perform the service in question. We've had some issues with demand response, as most of the other RTOs have had. And the main issues are on the settlement side. Okay, and it has to do with the counterfactual in terms of energy markets, energy provision. How do we measure something that didn't occur? How do we measure what you would have done but for the call, for the instruction by MISO to perform? And so that's, as I spoke yesterday in the presentation I gave, I talked about we have various measurement and verification techniques where we're trying to measure the counterfactual. The issues that are created, two major ones, I think I'll talk about this later when the questions come up. Two major issues we're trying to measure the counterfactual, the notion of adverse selection and moral hazard. Okay, moral hazard is if you're a big NBA fan, there's been a little bit of moral hazard, not with LeBron. LeBron does, he's 40 years old. He's 40 freaking years old. He's performing at the highest level in the NBA. He can take load management and it's real. But there's been some cases in the last week where other NBA players are doing sort of artificial curtailments, if you will. Okay, we'll leave it at that. The adverse selection, I'll give you a real example. My local utility that serves my needs a couple summers ago offered a program that said they're worried about a little bit of tight supply in the summertime. So they offered an incentive program, true story, for residential customers that said, if you reduce your consumption over the summer period by 10%, we'll give you a certain amount of credit. Because they're concerned about peak loads and things, right? That's great. That's great. This is like 3 years ago. Because 4 years ago, all my kids had left the house. And so between the year, the prior year and when they initiated this program, my kids had left. So my consumption went down naturally. I didn't have to do a thing. But I got the credits. So that's the adverse selection, moral hazard we'll talk about. Last thing is, again, no programs. We have, like most RTOs, really a one-sided market. All of what I just mentioned, these are demand resources participating in a supply resource. That has benefits. We think for provision of ancillary services, there's no issue in trying to measure the counterfactual. We can get that. We can get true performance, and we have for provision of ancillary services. And for a resource adequacy, we don't see much of an issue. It's more on the energy side where we have the settlement, where we have a truly one-sided market. If we could get more of our load serving entities put in price bids and respond to those in real time, we really need to move to a more two-sided market. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I do not have any basketball jokes. I'm just going to note that. Okay. Those were good though. I'm Amber Motley. I'm the director of short-term forecasting at the California ISO over on the western side of the United States. I've been spending a lot of time in the demand flexibility conversation the last couple years. You're probably like, why is the forecaster in the demand flexibility conversation? Ultimately, what's happening in the short-term world in the operational planning time horizon when it relates to demand flexibility, whether it's on the supply side of the equation or it's on the demand side of the equation, affects the actual. And because it affects the actual, it ultimately affects the forecast that's going into it. So with that, the California, and we've heard a lot about this week, California in the West, as well as the rest of the United States, as well as the world, are really transitioning to a decarbonized future, an electrified system, and some of that is coming very quickly, which other panelists have covered. Demand flexibility is going to become an increasingly vital asset to support that grid reliability. It's going to need to meet state policy goals and manage system costs. The California ISO is really envisioning a future where the demand flexibility enabled by automation, of the distributed energies and innovative demand response programs. We'll talk about supply versus demand. I don't want to tease that question out yet. And dynamic rate designs is going to be needed to reliably and economically integrate them into grid operations and market optimization. It's really important that as we work on this conversation, it goes all the way from the utility DO to the utility TO to the ISO to get integrated, whether it be on the demand side or on the supply side of the equation. So where has CAISO been as it relates to demand flexibility? So as some of you guys have probably participated in the programs over the last year, there's been a lot going on in the space of demand flexibility programs overall. We started demand response programs very similar to Michael earlier in the early 2000s. That's where the program's proxy demand response, reliability demand response came from. They've evolved. Those are on the market side, supply side. They evolved further with FERC 222, where you had more supply side resources coming in to the aggregated DER resources, or the DERAs, lots of acronyms. And those have evolved over time. This year, we kicked off a demand working group. We call it DDEMI, more acronyms. But we wanted to expand the combination of the focus of market and non-market participating resources. So we know that all the programs previously that we've talked about really are focusing on those programs that come and talk to the market and tell the market a bid structure on the supply side of the equation, or maybe in the future on the demand side of the equation. The piece that we have not talked about as much is how do we further integrate it all the way from the utility DO to the ISO, the non-market participating flexibility that's there. And one will tell you that there's megawatts in the market participating flexibility, but there is a lot of demand flexibility that is not participating in the markets. There's two ways to kind of go about that, right? There's ways to kind of continue to evolve those programs within the market structures and increase that participation. But ultimately, you're going to end up in a place where you have both of the resources there, a non-market participating and market participating. So how do you solve both of them? So with that, we've been talking to a lot of people. We've had different meetings, different forums, some of them with industry thought leaders this year, as well as really working with some of our transmission and distribution customers within the CAISO BAA, as well as the WEIM and future EDAM footprints. And we've led ourselves to a few strategic goals I'm going to put out there for us. One is we need to empower reliable, efficient, and seamless integration of the demand flexibility. And the second one is we need to bridge the communication and coordination from the transmission distribution through the ISO with the visibility and communication, and that needs to be automated. The roles and responsibilities need to be highlighted and clear in delineation lines. But we also need to address the current challenges in advancing demand flexibility. And that comes with working with the state entities to help support resource adequacy and long-term planning. And we also need to ensure that we have robust demand and uncertainty forecasting using these technologies and collaborative frameworks. Forecasting has typically been, until rooftop solar came, but a top-down approach, right? The ISOs are going to look from the top and they're going to go and look at what that forecast is going to be. When rooftop solar came, it was one element that started becoming more of a bottom-up forecast. There is a transition on how we're going to do the demand forecast or what the demand plan is going to be for the day. And that's really crucial to reliable operations because at the end of the day, you still have to balance the supply versus the demand. So ultimately, that's led into further conversations about different coordination frameworks. But one of the things that we have really learned through the conversations is that the coordination framework, the technology is important, right? The design of the market is important and crucial to the conversation. Obviously, you need policy and regulatory alignment, but the coordination framework that has to occur is really essential to enable the effective and responsible use of the demand flexibility. We need to lean into the coordination framework so that we can continue to have that efficient, reliable service at the same time we walk the regulatory change, at the same time that we walk the technology changes, at the same time that we walk the market design enhancements. They should be complementary to all of the systems that are there. So with that, I reminisced about demand flexibility as I was preparing for the session. And one of the things that reminded me of my earlier career days, maybe this will date me, we'll see. But when renewable forecasting came about many, many years ago, as a forecaster, I remember I was working for Xcel Energy at the time. I remember that they came to me and said, hey, can you forecast these wind resources? And I was like, well, sure, you can forecast the wind resources. And they're like, hey, they're in the panhandle of Texas. And I'm like, okay, they're in the panhandle. Is that all you have for me to forecast these resources? And they're like, yes. I'm like, do we have an address? An address would be helpful. In some ways, it reminds me a lot of what has occurred over time with renewable forecasting. The demand flexibility is there, but do we have the address of the demand flexibility to help us figure out where we can capture it, where we can shift it, and where we can move it over time? how it fits into the operational energy space, and then the dominoes fall of providing ancillary services and RA and all of the other components that come along with it. There's a lot of synergies there from renewables. And I think many of us from years ago could not believe where we have come with renewables. So I think we will come there with demand flexibility as well.
So I'm actually going to try and stand up here so you guys don't have to pass the mics quite as far. Not because I have anything profound to say. So I do want to start to talk a little bit now about some of the services from demand side. So I think you've already heard from the panelists some of the promise. We heard a lot about 30 to $50 billion, I think from Sanem as potential numbers. Even in the power industry where we often talk in hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, that is still a big number. And as an electric customer, I would say that continues to be a big number. We also heard about some of the challenges from Mike and from Amber on the coordination. How are we going to get that? What are some of the challenges we've seen? So we want to talk a little bit about what are the services that distributed resources, which as we heard from Karen, can be tens of megawatts of behind the meter generation, diesel gensets, natural gas, batteries, to thermostats and EVs. We have a huge array of potential resources. We also heard a lot of different services that they could provide. We're going to talk about what are those services and do we actually think as a community that those can be provided in a reliable way where our system operators can really depend on them. So I'm going to challenge the panel, and they did have a heads up on this, but I'm going to make them answer a question quickly. So I've asked them to just limit themselves to about 1 or maybe 2 sentences. So I want to ask the panelists, so as we think about across all of the types of DER resources and all of the types of load flexibility and the services that they could provide, what do you think is the most valuable resource, just valuable service, just one, that you think that these resources could provide?
There's a lot to be said for avoiding transmission and distribution costs, but maybe it's just the fact that, we're a power company. It's really about avoiding the generation, the energy and capacity costs of goods sold during those times when you're hitting the supply curve all the way up and to the right, that last unit whose fixed costs are otherwise going to be spread over a really small number of hours, creating real price pressures to try to periodically rely on demand to avoid the need for that last generating unit. Or looked at, it's now 3 sentences, looked at through the lens of our current moment where we seem to require every resource by virtue of economics or governmental fiat, allowing demand flexibility to be a service that new coming loads can bring on so that the threat of their incremental demand doesn't socialize problems of resource inadequacy to everyone.
Okay, from the industrial perspective, I think that I think demand response provides some extra reliability, some extra headroom when there is some system situations that are tight, or if we're seeing, a lot of demand all at once. I think, having that ability to have demand back down can add that sort of almost a reliability resource. It's not a technical term, but having that extra headroom, I think we see it as a very valuable tool for reliability.
Thank you. I'm going to go with distribution deferral. And that's mainly because I'm in the weeds with a lot of distribution planning efforts right now. And I know that that whole EVs will cluster, building management and heat pumps will be adopted is already starting to happen in several places right now. And I can see how distribution engineers are struggling because they don't have those transformers. They're not going to get another, substation for the next 5 years if they already don't have those in their stocks. So deferring some of those distribution investments 3-5 years is super valuable. And there are proven ways to do that. So you could actually patch together a robust portfolio of distributed energy resources, demand response, storage, and even efficiency and distributed solar, and get yourself a really reliable way to keep that peak loading limits of that distribution asset from running into the constraints. So, and it's super underappreciated at this time, but I expect that it will become exceedingly important in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. For MISO, the most valuable service would be the provision of spinning reserve by load, by demand flexibility. That's the value to MISO. From a market participant's point of view, the value clearly is the ability for these load management assets to provide resource adequacy.
It is hard to pick just one. I'll say that. But I think if I was to pick one, it'd be energy. I think that as the demand flexibility shows itself in the energy space, then it's going to ultimately lead to the other services, RA, AS, deferred T, and deferred D. So I think that they're all related, but I think to help further harness demand flexibility and move it along, proving in energy will help with all of the other dominoes down the way.
I don't know about anyone else. I expected everyone to say resource adequacy. And we got 5 different answers. 4 different answers, 5 different answers. Yeah, 4 or 5 different answers across our panel, which I'll say I found surprising. And I think folks in the audience probably do too. It's interesting. So I'm actually, Travis, I'm going to pick on the service that you called out, which is resource adequacy. And when we look at not, and I think to Mike's point, not necessarily where the highest value to the system is, but where most demand response programs outside of Texas tend to get their revenue is through capacity market programs. So looking at a resource adequacy perspective. And we've also had questions about whether or not these types of resources really are reliable enough to depend on for resource adequacy. And so, Travis, and I'm not going to put you on the spot in terms of putting you in front of a commission, but what types of load side resources do you think are or could be reliable enough for resource adequacy purposes?
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly important to realize at the outset that these are not, your typical resources that tend to be furnished to the market for the principal purpose of providing resource adequacy, right? People make investments in the technologies that enable demand response, usually for private purposes. A hospital is not buying a backup generator to help society at large. They're helping their patients. And there's a lot of heterogeneity among the customers who might be providing this. This isn't just, do you have a Hitachi or a Siemens or a GE combustion turbine or reciprocating engine? And those questions of duration, opportunity cost, private value make the question you're asking particularly thorny. But a few basic principles are in our commercial and industrial customer book. We definitely see a desire, because of that first use case nature of demand flexibility, for whoever we're dealing with, Karen's members, them really wanting and needing the supervisory control on their premise. They want to run their aluminum smelter. They don't want us, their energy manager, pushing a button on their operations. It would not be safe for us to do so. Meanwhile, and perhaps ironically, there's more comfort, safety, expectance in smaller customer classes to actually have remote and direct control on some of their appliances like HVAC. The transaction costs associated with tapping into that demand response can't reasonably be expected to be managed by the energy manager, AKA mom. So it's okay, or dad. So it's okay for that to be outsourced with customer consent to the upstream market. And then finally, how is it reliable? I mean, I'm a great believer, I hope we all are, in the power of incentives. The way to do this is if you're entering into a binding contractual obligation to furnish capacity to the market for, the social good of everyone in the market, you really need to face substantial penalties for non-compliance. And there are certain markets like PJM that do that. If you sign up for a baseline that you underperform during a performance assessment event in PJM, it's not just you forfeiting your revenue for a year in the capacity market, it's you forfeiting your revenue for many, many, many years, potentially. You're really going deep into the red as a result of your non-performance. And ironically, when we look back on things like Winter Storm Elliott, the financial penalties that faced people who failed to perform on their demand response commitment obligations in the capacity market, those financial penalties were more severe than the regulated utilities outside of RTOs that actually had firm load shed in EEA3. Ironically, they faced no financial penalties at all. So I think FERC has actually done a reasonably good job establishing stringent financial penalties. But there are some markets where you fall short of that. I think it really begins and ends with making sure there's skin in the game for people who decide to step out of the private use, decide to step out of the organic responsiveness paradigm that I was talking about in my opening, and decide to offer it in as a supply resource. The rules of the game have to change if you're doing that.
Sanem, as you've worked with utilities on designing these kinds of programs, going to state commissions, does that resonate? Do you have that same sort of view of resource adequacy and the ability of different types of resources to be able to actually meet that resource adequacy requirement?
Yeah, so I think anytime a resource is controllable, like Travis mentioned, it's contracted and there are binding financial penalties. I think those resources are resource adequacy grade for me. And there are many of these programs. There are utility direct load control programs, you know, heat pumps and thermostats and water heaters, many charging programs. They are all fall into that category, especially if they're aggregated by aggregators, because those aggregators have their own contractual agreements with utilities. And if they don't meet those requirements, they're going to pay really big penalties. They don't even get paid sometimes on their overall contract if they don't meet some goals. They're very stringent at times. They're also CNI interruptible and firm service level contracts that are again associated with a lot of different penalties. So there's a really good portfolio of resources that can respond to price signals and dispatch signals pretty rapidly and reliably. And there are things like behavioral programs and price response products that could be reliable, but I don't know that they are going to be resource adequacy grade, and there needs to be a lot of due rates to apply to be able to rely those as capacity resources for resource adequacy purposes.
I will say I was in a conversation once, not with personnel from any of the ISOs up here on the board, but with a relatively senior person in an ISO who said, none of this will ever be reliable because whenever I get a call for demand response on my thermostat, I just manually go turn it back up. So we have a customer viewpoint here that is pretty clear that says under the right circumstances, yes. And I'm curious from our markets folks, you know, as you're hearing this, and I'm not asking you to say necessarily going forward, but just what have you seen so far from performance? Has it seemed like it's been sufficiently reliable? Y'all are really responsible for keeping the lights on at the end of the day. Long question, which basically say, have you seen demand side resources be sufficiently reliable, make you feel comfortable relying on them for resource adequacy?
Yeah, well, as a market designer, I'm comfortable with them as we've improved our processes the last few years. If you go talk to the operators, they're not. The operators, I think somebody mentioned in a previous session, really want steel in the ground and transmission to be able to support the power balance. But we do have quite a bit of demand response participating as a supply resource in MISO, like 12,000 megawatts. Most of those are only callable when we get into emergency situations. So that's where the operators get uncomfortable. They don't want to be calling emergencies that don't show up. So prematurely calling emergencies, and they're sort of reluctant at the same time to wait till the last minute to call on these. So in many cases, these resources are really reliable. We need to do our checks and our balances We have stepped up that process after we've had a few issues over the last few years. But really the main thing I think we could do, as I mentioned in my opener, is we're treating these as supply resources. And so when in our capacity construct, we don't sort of decrement the demand, but we sort of put it into the supply curve. It ends up being the same thing because they can put in offers. But if we can move that over to the energy market, where in our day-ahead market, those with the obligation to serve load serving entities can put in price sensitive demand bids. In the real time, we don't have that functionality. It's mainly because there's very few end use customers in our footprint that are facing some sort of variant of dynamic prices that reflect real-time LMPs. There's very little of that. I know of 3 or 4 customers, big customers, who they can't put in a price bid in our markets, but they deemed it cost effective to have somebody full-time monitoring the LMPs we flash on our screen every 5 minutes and sort out whether to either increase consumption or reduce consumption. It's that valuable to them. But if all the evidence shows, the empirical studies show, we don't need a huge price elasticity in the markets. If we can, I just want to get it moving from perfectly inelastic to somewhat inelastic. If we can get 5 or 10% of our load that's price sensitive, that would do marvelous things in terms of market efficiency.
Yeah, no, I think I'm trying to remember back to the original question,
Yeah,
but
right.
it was, as it relates to demand response in RA, right? Ultimately, demand response has the ability on the supply side within CAISO already to get RA credit. So there are RA accredited demand response resources within the supply side. I think one of the things that is there right now is we've seen over the years, programs grow outside of the market. I'm sure you've seen some of those within the news and the headlines, right? The Tesla aggregators, with the battery dispatches that are happening within programs. You see their impact into the demand curve. You could go on today's Outlook, our little app, you can see top of the hour movement every day, right? Because they're doing time of use change and time of use movement on a daily basis. But they're also available at an additional capacity when notified outside of that. And there is extra demand flexibility that still sits on the system that is there and can be tapped into. At that point, when it goes back to controllability, right? And we were talking about controllability earlier. I think how we define controllability is really important. And then I think the other thing that's really important is they need to be time dependable, right? Like if I need an RA resource, is it a 5-minute notification? Is it a 15-minute notification? They have to have a time dependability to them. They have to be able to give us a forward quantifiable value of what they're going to do to the system that is trustworthy. And if the operators trust that, then you realize the full benefit of the demand flexibility that's there. But if the operators are not going to trust that that resource is going to show up, you're not going to realize all of the value that you could if that trust was there. And I think it can come with time, but I think that it will ultimately lead to a more coordination for those out of market resources that are more elastic in nature. They're not there every day on the market side because I think they have potential, but those will be the ones to think about controllability and how they come in.
So when you said timeline, you said 5 or 15 minutes. I was looking at Karen to see how she was going to respond. So as I think, and you also said accredited. So as we think about some of these resources in capacity markets, and as we think about how capacity markets are changing, we're not doing accreditation based on peak hour anymore. Looking at most risk hours. We're also looking at shorter and shorter lead times. And Karen, I can't help but think of you and your constituents as you're talking about that. I mean, what is the appetite from industrial customers, from your perspective, what you've heard, to go to these shorter lead times and less predictable call times?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really difficult. As these timelines get a little bit shorter, I mean, we know that industrial processes are very complicated. They're very calibrated. They are, on certain schedules. And so, usually when, our companies participate, it usually is sometimes a 12, 24-hour period notice for them to perhaps, rejigger whatever their operations are, or move their operations to a different plant. There are opportunities to back down generation back down demand on a shorter timeline for less critical operations. So if, they can somehow bring down heating or cooling, or if they can back off, their central office, send everybody home for the day. Then I think that some of those, inessential or unessential services, could respond on a shorter timeline. But to really have an industrial customer respond and be reliable and see value in that really does have to be a contractual, and there has to be a legitimate timeline that they can react to. And so you can't just call up, an aluminum plant and say, hey, we've got some problems, shut down 15 minutes. That's just not going to happen. So it really does need to be contractual. And
Sorry.
no.
I was just, sorry, Amber, did you want to?
I just wanted to say one thing, because the 15 minutes is an example. But I do think that that's where the different programs come in, right? I think that there's valuable but like when we talk about, well, do they want to provide AS, right? AS comes with time requirements, but I think that there's different programs that are helpful across, that would have different time dependencies.
And I was just going to go piggybacking on Karen, but also reacting to kind of Michael's conceptual observation about operators, not really feeling altogether comfortable with leaving the dispatch of this stuff to an emergency, and therefore wanting understandably to sort of pre-commit some if they think an emergency is reasonably likely. But what that has meant empirically on the ground in situations like 2025 is that we are seeing a lot more calls of quote unquote emergency demand response. And we've gone from a situation where you might have, 1 or 2 calls a season, possibly no calls a season, to in MISO having, 2 calls in the winter and then 10 calls this summer for a total of 74 hours. And that is a lot of interruption for a commercial and industrial business. A similar magnitude of calls in PJM. And then really concerningly, some of these incidents have not occurred when the market for energy itself is exactly screaming emergency. I mean, the call that happened in PJM, a really big call that was PJM wide on July 29, happened during 6 hours where the LMP hardly cracked $300 a megawatt hour. And in most of the prints was under $100 a megawatt hour. And so you got something wrong if you're relying on an emergency demand response resource. And the thing you would conventionally be expecting to do the work of near-term resource adequacy, the locational marginal price is not actually clicking in any recognizable way. You stop having a market and you start having a much more managed operator-based system. And that's not the bargain that customers like Karen's and mine signed up for. And meanwhile, just at the final point here, ironically, because some of the utility programs in restructured markets in particular are optimizing around, T&D peaks, but those utilities don't own responsibility for the energy costs of goods sold. You had the opposite situation in PJM where customers like me, where I'm enrolled in a utility smart thermostat program, even though the LMP in my area was $2,000 a megawatt hour, my thermostat was not cycling. It was the AC was just running straight throughout. Because it's not their problem. That's not their cogs. That's not what the program is designed to do. So there's a problem of missing incentives and a lack of co-optimization from these resources that probably are more nimble and responsive and less disruptive to commercial operations.
I would love to spend more time on this, and I hope we get some good questions on it. I am going to transition a little bit to talk about the oversight issue because it has been in the headlines this year. We've seen a lot of oversight from the Office of Enforcement at FERC. We've seen a good amount of conversation around that. And I think there are some real questions here about who can provide oversight, what's the right model as we think about oversight to give those operators the reassurance that they need, that the resources are going to be there, that oversight plays an important role. And so I'm going to ask just again, very quickly, one or two sentences. I've noticed some semicolons sneaking into these sentences about who do you think is best positioned to perform oversight of the demand side resources? Is it ISOs, IMMs? Is it state authorities? Is it FERC? Where do you think it lies?
Oh, boy, I'm first. Okay. I want to say it's a little bit of all of us in a way, right? Because it depends where that program is sitting. If that program is sitting as a market bidding resource, then I think it fits within the ISOs. And then of course, if it fits in the ISO, the DMM and comes with, right? But for the resources that may provide demand flexibility and electricity as it relates to out of market resources, then I think it goes into state jurisdiction in combination with the ISO. Because if we're counting on those megawatts to show up, and it goes back to the trust of the system and needing to have that holistic approach of getting it all the way to the ISO to realize the most benefit. I think the ISO is still in the conversation, but it still sits with the jurisdiction of the state who formed the program or wherever that program is sitting.
Yeah, I would agree with Amber on that. If there's a demand response asset that's participating in MISO, then it's our responsibility to ensure that that we have the rules set up, the charges, the credits, the penalties in place, so that we can ensure that this asset performs and provides a service that it's been selected and cleared for. Now we also have in MISO anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts of demand side programs. Okay, so that's not part of MISO. They're not participating in our market. These are demand side programs that our load serving entities are sponsoring and using. They can use them at their whim. They can use them to mitigate LMPs in our market. We don't have visibility into them, and it's on them and the relevant electric retail regulatory authority to ensure that those are useful assets.
And maybe I can speak to a little bit regulatory oversight at the state level, because again, state regulators have the oversight on utility load flexibility programs. There are very structured processes for approving these programs. Then utilities have to undertake benefit cost analysis. Once they complete some of these programs, they have to go back and show very detailed evaluation, measurement, and verification studies. There is this concept of MMV 2.0, which involves constant monitoring of some of these programs and resources. There are oversight provisions related to lack of performance, and also making it easier for customers, when they can opt out, what are the consequences of them opting out. And to the extent that some of these programs factor into utilities resource plans as well as distribution system plans, those are also exceedingly getting audited and analyzed by the utility commissions and staff, because based on those resources, you're not building that extra peaker, or you're not building that additional transformer. So there's a pretty robust oversight on utility retail DR programs.
No semicolons. So I'll just say, yeah, I think it is program dependent, whether you're bidding into a market or if you're outside of a market and you're in a utility program, The only thing that I will add is whatever oversight entity is there, they have to have penalty authority and enforcement authority. You can't have a program and then not be able to penalize those that do not perform. So making sure that whoever is overseeing this does have some sort of penalty authority.
Yeah, kind of two different answers for me. Certainly for the demand response that we offer as a supply resource to create resource adequacy for the greater good of the whole. I think it's RTO's responsibility to know their customer, that is to say us, and what we have in terms of the provision of demand response. But then we're also on our way to having about a 1 gigawatt virtual power plant in Texas that's created through our organic retail offers. Those offers are retail contracts in the restructured market that are not regulated by the state. They're not regulated. Well, they're certainly not regulated by FERC, it being Texas. They're really just private party contracts where HVAC flexibility is bundled into the retail price offering. And of course, I'm sure some of our people at our own trading desk would like to hold our customers' feet to the fire and absolutely make sure they perform. We also are fully cognizant that if our retail customers are dissatisfied, they will fire us as their retail electric provider. And so we would like to not be shorter than we need to be in terms of being able to depend on those resources. We also want to retain that book of customers in a retail competitive framework. So there's a balancing act that frankly, and I'll be honest, we're not commissioning 1,000-page EM and V reports for the satisfaction of the people who are financially responsible for managing these programs, like you might have to do with state programs either. That kind of characteristic is definitely one of the reasons why I continue to vote for option number one, demand acting as demand in more of a retail competitive context to try to activate some of this demand. It's just much more of a willing buyer, willing seller construct.
That was many semicolons. But important. Guys, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Beal to talk a little bit about what's happened in MISO to give some context for some of this. But before we do that, can I ask, are folks in the audience already familiar with some of the issues that have happened in MISO and the Office of Enforcement? None. All right.
Great dramatic reading of a deposition, if you ever want to do it.
I concur. Mike, can we hand it over to you though to give us a little bit of an overview of the types of issues that you've seen? I think that's good for folks to understand some of the challenges.
Sure, thanks. So as I mentioned, the biggest problem we have when you have demand resources acting as a supply resource in the energy markets is trying to measure the counterfactual. What would this guy have done but for the call by MISO to drop load? We don't know that, right? So so it introduces these two issues of adverse selection and moral hazard. Adverse selection, I gave you a real example in my case, but let me give you a different one. So we have a lot of auto factories in our footprint. These guys were not the culprit. I'm just using this as an example. Auto factories. I'm a little bit knowledgeable on some of their practices. In many cases, these facilities were shut down operations between Christmas and New Year's. Take holiday. Okay, stop building cars or trucks. So if that particular factory was an asset and putting in offers into our market, it is not appropriate for them to be clearing a demand resource megawatt amount during that time when they were not actually operating. Okay, those were in the rules even prior to this enforcement action. They weren't doing this. This was a steel mill in one case and a case up in I can't remember what the other one was, but in the first case, yeah, they were recognizing that as an asset owner, they're represented by a vertically integrated utility, a load serving entity. The load serving entity was the market participant, but this in-use customer was recognizing that there were certain periods over time where they were not operating. And so they would submit offers to ensure that they cleared them. So we would send them instruction to drop load when in fact they weren't doing anything. So you got to do something. When we send you an instruction, you clear in our auctions and our day ahead of real-time market, you have to actually do something. You have to curtail load, whether it's introducing behind the meter generation to offset some load or actually dropping load. You have to take that action. And so that was the first case. That's the adverse selection issue. The moral hazard one is because again, you can't measure the counterfactual. So we have to use baseline approaches. And in MISO, we use a 10 and 10 calculated baseline. So if you cleared, if you were an asset here and you cleared at hour ending 15 today, so we send you an instruction, say to drop 10 megawatts in hour and 15 right now today. Okay, the way we try to measure what would you have been doing is we'll go back and look for we'll go back in the last 10 days. So today's Wednesday, so we're going to look at 10 non-event days, Monday through Friday. We don't take Saturday or Sunday, non-holiday days. We'll go back in the most recent 10 non-event days for hour ending 15. And we'll collect your meter data and we'll take that and average that to see. That's the estimate of what you would have been doing, but for the call. Okay. Well, the moral hazard is there's an incentive to inflate the baselines. And this other entity, it was an air separation entity that creates gases through air separation processes. They recognize that, so they are actually running their facilities and spewing the gases out their smokestack. They're actually running their facility just to inflate the baseline to get higher electricity consumption during the 10 and 10 days, so that when we compared what they did when they got selected compared to their baseline, they look like they're doing more than they did. So that's the artificial curtailments. Those were the two major issues on the energy side and the capacity side. You had a couple of market participants who were scrubbing data from the local utility and gathering account IDs and registering those, even though the end use customers behind those IDs had not signed up for their programs to be able to participate in MISO. Those are all the actions. We went through a long stakeholder process to improve the rules. We have since stood up a demand response department that's doing has been ramping up and sort of monitoring all the offers, all the behaviors of all the different demand assets that are participating in MISO.
Thanks, Mike. And I think when you sort of hear those examples of, and we know that this has happened across all of the markets. This is not limited to MISO. And I think when you hear that, you can hear why a system operator might have some reticence to really rely on some of these resources. And I'm curious.
Yeah,
Especially
let me
from
jump
Amber
in and
Mike.
mention there's a very famous one in PJM, the baseball stadium in Baltimore, Camden Yards, where the operator was putting the lights on during the day to inflate its baseline so that when PJM made the call, it looked like they were dropping a lot of load. And somebody nearby noticed, why is the baseball stadium, which is not having a game at this time, have their lights on? So that's how they.
3 strikes and you're out. So I'm curious though, like, how do we get operators to feel comfortable with these resources? What is it going to take? How many reps once you call on a resource and you're relying on it and it doesn't respond? You're understandably going to be a little gun shy from relying on it the next time. I think Amber might, but by all means, if other folks on the panel have opinions.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. In terms of ancillary services, there's no worries. As Amber mentioned, for spin and supplemental, these are 10-minute products. And when we have a contingency reserve event and say you've cleared spin and we have demand resources clearing spin, you clear spin and we have an event, our operators call an event and call on you to drop your load. You have 10 minutes to respond. That's the nature of the product. And we collect meter data in this particular case for the 5-minute meter period right before we call the event and 10 minutes in. And then at the end, the length of the curtailment as well. So we have a very good snapshot of what were you doing 5 minutes before? Because you had no inkling. Market participants would not know when an event was occurring. So in that particular case for ancillary services, even regulation, there's really no worries about lack of performance. So we're quite comfortable with that, but it's on the energy side that's really worrisome.
I think it all comes down to trust, right? And I think in gaining that trust, it really is, you need to see it, you need to feel it, you need to think, if you called on it and you needed it in 5 minutes, you saw that the load came off in 5 minutes. I would say that the cases like this or even, I mean, you can look at some of our DMM reports as well, and they talk about the performance of the supply side, PDRR and RDRR resources within there as well. That's something that we need to think about the best solutions of why these things are occurring. If it's an incentive thing, if it's a penalty component, like we've mentioned before, and make sure that the structures are there to help support those resources to one, either not behave in that fashion, or two, give them a pathway to be able to get the credit for what they're doing on a system that is reliable and dependable. So I think that it's going to take some time, and it's going to take some innovative solution paths to get there. But I think it starts all the way with the different programs and where those programs are coming from, which some of them are the utility, some of them are the state, some of them are within the market, and just really working together to make sure that the incentive structure is there.
And, maybe it's easier for me to say this because I don't keep the electricity on by running these programs, but I just think that throwing our hands in the air and say, oops, we tried and didn't work. And these are too disruptive to the operations. So therefore we're going to limit participation is definitely not an option. And not that I'm hearing it from my ISO colleagues. The thing to do is to just learn and evolve, right? As sounds like what we've been doing, and trying to make a few exemplary cases like this that, any market participant would clearly understand the consequences of any wrongdoing and how they would essentially make the headlines and would have extreme penalties and would never get to play again. So I think those kinds of really high penalty situations will hopefully help us get ahead of these situations. And just there's a lot of, telemetry requirements, analysis of the data. Those are all the things will help us get better and better in implementing these programs and solutions.
And, I'll just say again that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the demand response resource. And I guess I'll also say that capacity markets are not this kind of highly dynamic, nimble market that prices every 5 minutes in order to convey a signal and in order to define a product. I mean, the PJM market buys and sells an annualized product that's meant to be marked against some kind of ideal of capacity, and no resource that offers into it is ideal, which is why you have effective load carrying capability D rates of any resource, notwithstanding the fact that the number that comes out of there, is subject to the kind of performance obligations. But a lot in the DR context, what that means is that you as an operator can either have, nothing of nothing or something of something. Like, let's take the automotive industry as an example. If you were going to be really hard up on that as an example and say, well, because you take 5 days out of 365 days off, you are disqualified from offering capacity into an annualized capacity market, that means that you're precluding the opportunity to actually dispatch that DR resource during any of the other days when, but for that exclusion, it might be offered into the market. So, do you want to be the Inspector Javert of market design, or would you like to be more pragmatic about this? Now, again, putting all that to the side, I do think a configuration where, a lot more of this is happening through the energy market's emergent signals, or a lot more of it, if you do have a capacity market, you're still gaining more demand flexibility out of responsiveness to the demand related cost allocation of capacity is probably in the long term a better way to go about this. But even then, there's some work to be done because, in PJM, the way people incur obligations and pay for capacity is based on what you're using during the 5 gross peak loads of the summer in PJM. And as all of you know, as we've moved to a system where system tightness doesn't just exist in the summer, where system tightness doesn't just exist at the gross peak, where it's emergent at the peak net load hours, you're actually sending the wrong price signal on to the demand side of the equation. So you're kind of like, there's a lot of work to be done, interestingly, on both option 1 and option 2, if you've taken the first step, as so many markets have, of having a capacity market to begin with to guarantee resource adequacy. It's just like one more problem of market design heaped onto the pile of capacity markets. Just venting.
Capacity markets have never had issues, Travis. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Yeah.
No.